This is Professor Stephen Litch in the Principles of Economics, and I'm going to talk about a couple of markets that are out of equilibrium. So these are specifically going to be a market with a price floor, which is a minimum price that can be paid for a good or a service, and next a price ceiling, which is a maximum price. Okay, first the price floor. The best example of a price floor would probably be a minimum wage. So a price floor is a law requiring that a certain price must be paid for a good or a service. A minimum wage is a minimum price that can be paid for labor services. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a labor market specifically. So here's my supply and demand diagram. The price, okay, so the way I think of people working on a daily basis is that we households are supplying our labor to firms and our employers are buying it from us. We sell our labor at a fixed rate per hour. Um, that's kind of an approximation or simplification. In my case, I really sell my labor per course that I teach. But okay, for this simple model, workers are selling their labor at an hourly rate. The price of labor is the wage paid to the workers. And the quantity in this market is the amount of labor employed. Okay, so two sides of the market. The labor supply, that comes from workers. They're the ones supplying the labor to the firms, and the labor demand comes from the employers. All right. Now, the market would have an equilibrium in the absence of any regulations, in the absence of any interference. The equilibrium occurs where demand and supply intersect. So I've got that marked. There's an equilibrium wage paid to labor, P star, and a quantity of labor employed, Q star, in equilibrium. Okay, great. Here's my market with no regulations. This market is in equilibrium. Then suppose the government passes a law requiring that workers must be paid at least some amount. Now, for this model, I'm calling that amount P bar, P with a line above it. Currently, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. During the recent presidential debates, I heard a couple of Democratic candidates suggesting raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Okay, so this model explains what would happen if a minimum wage were enacted. Like if a law were passed requiring that workers be paid a wage that's higher than the market equilibrium. Okay, so here is this minimum wage, P bar. Workers must be paid at least P bar. And so let me just say, employers will not pay them a penny more than that. Okay, at a wage of P bar, we can go and look at the labor supply curve in order to know how many workers would want to work at this wage of P bar. Okay, and that's going to be QS, quantity supplied, comes off of the labor supply curve. The labor demand curve tells us the number of workers that employers would want to hire at a wage of P bar. So I've labeled that as QD. Okay, so raising this minimum wage or setting a minimum wage above the market equilibrium would distort labor decisions. More workers would want to find jobs, but employers would not hire as many workers. Remember, in equilibrium, everyone who wanted a job could find a job. There were no jobs that went unfulfilled. Every employer found a worker, and there were no workers who went without jobs. So that was the equilibrium. But this higher minimum wage encourages more workers to look for jobs, but employers can't afford to hire all of them. And I think of the employers as making a very simple cost benefit analysis when hiring a worker. Does the worker produce more than the cost of employing that worker? So if there were a worker who could produce $10 worth of goods for my company, if I had to pay that worker $7.25 an hour, that's the current minimum wage, I'd employ that worker. But if the minimum wage were increased to $15 and the worker produced only $10 worth of goods, I simply would not employ the worker. The revenue the worker generates is less than the cost to me. So that's the reason that the quantity demanded has decreased. Some of those workers who were not very productive are no longer employed. So this gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, those are all workers who want to find jobs, but they can't find them. Okay? The economic term for that is unemployment. Now, the definition of a worker being employed is essentially the worker wants to find a job, but cannot find a job. And that's exactly the right description of these workers between QD and QS. There's this surplus of labor, more workers looking for jobs than jobs are available. And a surplus of labor is called unemployment. Okay, so this is one of the predictions of our market analysis. Setting a minimum wage above the market equilibrium will create unemployment. And that unemployment comes from two sources. I'll sort of identify those separately. A portion of that comes from jobs that are lost due to the minimum wage. So these are the workers between QD and Q star. In equilibrium, the Q star workers would have been employed. When the minimum wage is set above the market equilibrium, employers will hire only QD workers. There are no more jobs available than that. There are only QD jobs available. So these workers between QD and Q star, they would have had jobs if the market were in equilibrium, but their jobs have disappeared due to the minimum wage. The other people who have joined unemployment are the workers between Q star and QS who began searching for jobs. So these are people who would not have wanted jobs when the market was in equilibrium because a wage of P star was not worth their time. They had better alternative uses of their time than working at a wage of P star. But a minimum wage that has been set higher than that encourages them to enter the job market. Okay, so they join the unemployed. So in some ways, this is doubly bad for some of the workers who had jobs when the market was in equilibrium. Remember, Q star workers had jobs when the market was in equilibrium. When the minimum wage was set higher than the market equilibrium, employers were not willing to employ more than QD workers. And so that's all the jobs there were. Doesn't matter what the quantity supplied was. It doesn't matter how many workers wanted jobs. All that really matters is QD jobs are being provided by employers and there are no more jobs. So some workers lose their jobs. The workers between QD and Q star lose their jobs. On top of that, there's more competition for the jobs from people who enter the labor market. The people between Q star and QS enter the labor market because the higher wages encourage them. Okay, so that's that's really the most important conclusion for now about the minimum wage. Our simple model predicts that minimum wages will create unemployment, and that unemployment comes from two sources: the workers who lose their jobs, plus more workers trying to find jobs. Now, I've talked about a price floor. That's a minimum price that must be paid for a service, labor. The opposite of that is a price ceiling, which is a maximum price. Best examples of price ceilings are rent-controlled apartments in some big cities. Okay, there are laws setting a maximum rent that can be charged for an apartment, or a maximum amount that rent can increase each year for an apartment. What I'm going to do now is analyze how that impacts the market. Okay, so here's my simple market for apartments. There's some supply of apartments, some demand for apartments. In the absence of any regulation, the market would be in equilibrium at a price of P star, quantity of Q star. Remember, the equilibrium always occurs where supply and demand intersect. Okay, then imagine the government passes a regulation that the price of an apartment may be no higher than, I'm going to call it P tilde, as that little wavy tilde on top of it. Okay, so that old equilibrium price of P star is no longer acceptable. The prices must be reduced to P tilde. Well, we can see what happens to quantity demanded and quantity supplied at this price. The demand curve tells us that at a price of P tilde, the quantity demanded would be QD. And the supply curve tells us the number of apartments that would be supplied at this price. I've labeled that QS. Now, again, there's a mismatch between the number of apartments that consumers would want to rent, QD, and the number of apartments that landlords would make available, QS. Whenever quantity supplied and quantity demanded are not the same, what actually gets sold in the market is the smaller of the two. Okay? In this case, QS. That's all the apartments that landlords will make available to renters. Okay, so everyone between QS and QD would like to find an apartment, but cannot. So I would describe that as a shortage of apartments, or excess demand for apartments. These apartments are scarce, difficult to find. Okay, and again, that's going to be the main implication of the model, is that rent controls or price controls will create shortages. And the shortages come from two different sources. So I'll split up that shortage. Some of that are apartments that are no longer available. So in equilibrium, Q-star apartments would have been available. Oh, let me go back a slide. In equilibrium, Q-star apartments would have been available. But if there's a limit to the price that landlords can charge, only QS will be available. Okay, so for various reasons or in various ways, landlords are not providing as many apartments. Maybe they decide to convert some of the apartments into condominiums that they can sell. Or they decide that instead of renting out an apartment that they owned, they will simply live there themselves. Or they can decide that they're not going to build some apartments that they would have in equilibrium. So, there are several reasons why fewer apartments can be supplied or would be supplied if the price were lower. Now, that's one thing that contributes to the shortage of apartments. The other is that more people start looking for apartments. When they hear that you can find an apartment for only P tilde dollars, then they think this is a great idea. These rent-controlled apartments are wonderful for consumers if they can find one. Okay, so there's a shortage, but the lower price attracts more people into the market than would have looked for apartments in equilibrium. Okay, so that's this difference between Q star and QD. So again, I'm going to go back, point out that, okay, how about right here? Point out that in equilibrium, P star apartments would have, or the price of an apartment would have been P star, number of apartments rented would have been Q star. But if there's a price ceiling, a maximum price that's set, then there will be a shortage of apartments. More people will want to rent apartments than the number of apartments that landlords would make available. Okay. And I decompose this shortage into two sources. Some of the shortage comes because fewer apartments are being supplied, and some of it comes because more people are demanding apartments. Okay. So, at this point, I am done talking about price floors and price ceilings.